Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have, I think, a truly extraordinary program for you this morning, this afternoon. We have Dritan Nisho, who's the founder and CEO of HarrisX, presenting the latest poll results on American attitudes towards Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the Trump administration's policy towards that war. And we have with us as well, to discuss the poll, we have Caitlin Dornbos of the New York Post, and we have Damian Murphy, who's the Senior Vice President at the Center for American Progress. And as I think you understand, the Post is a conservative paper, and of course, Damian, a long-term Democratic staffer, CAP, has a Democratic outlook. So we're gonna have a across-the-spectrum look at the poll results. And we'll now turn this over to Mr. Nisho to talk about the poll results.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning, and a special thank you to Ambassador Herbst for always having wonderful convening power and bringing us all together on a very important issue and topic, hopefully with the breakthroughs that we've seen in the Israel-Gaza, Israel-Hamas war recently, a breakthrough in the Russia-Ukraine war is next to come. And the goal today is really to look at where public opinion stands and how public opinion has shifted since the campaign, since late last year, around this issue. I'll breeze through about 15 slides in 10 minutes, and we'll have a pretty serious conversation and question and answer session afterwards to dive deep into any of the particular data, and I'm sure some of this will be provocative. So a little bit about the particulars. This information, this data is based on surveys from August and September, so very recent, within the last 60 days. Each are surveys of over 2,000 US voters. And it's a nationally representative sample. So when you look at the breakdowns across Democrats, Republicans, independents, and beyond, these are statistically sound, statistically relevant, and they've been holding for some months now. And as a survey, this survey, which is a collaboration between the Harvard Center for American Political Studies and my organization, Harris, we've been polling on this issue fairly consistently month after month since the beginning of the war. So what are the dynamics on the Russia-Ukraine war today? Well, it's no surprise to everyone that 2/3 of voters support the efforts to end the war in Ukraine. We see some interesting partisan splits there, and I was quite surprised to see that a slight majority of Democrats oppose the administration's efforts to end the war, but that has much more to do with what they think about the administration and the president than it does with the substance of the issue. But importantly, in all of this data, as I go through the various slides, is the shift that Republicans have undergone between the campaign, when a majority of Republican voters cooled on America's support for Ukraine and engaging in different ways to support Ukraine to get through the war and to get to a point where it can reach a resolution with Russia at the negotiating table, to where we stand today, where the consensus has reemerged that we need to strongly support Ukraine. The United States needs to strongly support Ukraine. Unfortunately, though, as we look at the data, the expectations that the war will come to a speedy resolution or to some kind of conclusions are quite low. And this is both positive and negative. It reflects a certain state of pessimism, but it also gives the administration wide latitude to push for a resolution in different ways, especially given the level of support that exists for bringing this war to an end. And when we look a step below, do voters support the Trump administration upping up the ante and increasing different types of pressures on Russia and its backers, we see that 3/4 of all voters support putting more economic sanctions on Russia to try to force it to the negotiating table and to end the war. And 57% support the recent initiative from the Trump administration to start thinking about how it imposes sanctions on other governments around the world that are buying oil and gas from Russia and essentially fueling the Russian war machine. Again, what's surprising about this data is the remarkable consistency of opinion. You see, it's a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents that support the administration to up the ante. And that's very important for many different reasons. Some of them are very obvious, but again, as I stated, the most important one of them is that this consensus did not exist as of the end of last year, as we were coming out of the election. And again, we saw remarkable softness in the position of Republicans at that time. President Trump, through his very public musings and frustrations on his dealings with Vladimir Putin, has shifted the perspective of Republicans. And one of the interesting things that we see in the data is that MAGA Republicans, self-identified MAGA Republicans, are more hawkish than traditional Republicans on this issue. And that's because the president has the ability through the bully pulpit to set the terms of the debates and to set the information flow that these voters need to be able to get behind support on some of these issues, which are obviously controversial and have their own costs diplomatically and from a geopolitical perspective. And again, when we conduct our polling, we try to iteratively go in multiple different directions and test different dimensions of the issue. And here, again, we tested whether or not the United States should put more pressure on its European partners around issues of oil and gas. And we are at the Atlantic Council, so I think this is worthwhile for our European friends to see that there's 80% support for that kind of an initiative and a policy, and that beat is very likely to continue from the administration until there is some kind of a deal or some kind of progress. But then very importantly, we asked the question, should the Trump administration continue to provide weaponry to Ukraine and impose further economic sanctions on Russia if it refuses to negotiate and end the bloodshed? And this is sort of an all of the above list of policy issues, or should it not do so for fear of antagonizing Russia? And we have tested different polarities that look at the importance of Russia as obviously a regional power and a geopolitical actor, and then the importance of Ukraine on the other end. And again, you see 68% supporting going the full mile, including 72% of Democrats, 73% of Republicans, a smaller number of independents, but independents for several years now have had a lot of global engagement fatigue stemming out of the Middle East and various engagements there and beyond. The fact that the administration can carry all of the different voter groups with such a policy is very important and is very telling. There's a lot of tailwind if Trump wants to push Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table through many, many different types of issues and policies and positions. And so I wanted to look a little bit at how did we get here and what are some of the different shifts that we are seeing. There was a very publicized summit in Alaska, which in the assessment of the administration itself and also voters, as we see in this data, didn't yield the necessary results. 60% of voters think that the meeting with Putin was unsuccessful. So that's a majority, and that number has been growing as we've been tracking the issue. And actually, when we've asked on the other side, do you think that the meetings with Zelensky and with the Europeans have been successful, we actually see more positive responses on that side. So the administration, either willingly or unwillingly, actually did more to unify the Europeans and coalesce them together than it did to reach some kind of a consensus or a new language with Russia itself. And again, win or lose, American voters tend to be very practical, very pragmatic. When President Trump goes out there and says this is about ending the bloodshed and it's about ending the war, they like it. And you see here that 57% believe that he deserves credit and for engaging in diplomacy and for sitting down across Vladimir Putin at the table, regardless of what we might think of such a normalization of the Russian president and obviously his actions over the last few years. And again, 60% do not believe that President Biden, the last president, could have pulled this off. And so they appreciate this in their president, and that's why the headline was "Win or Lose, they do appreciate the engagement." This is very important. 2/3 of Americans doubt the motivations of Vladimir Putin, especially him genuinely wanting to end the war. And when you ask about Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership, the numbers flip in the same proportion. So Ukraine and its leadership have a lot of goodwill that has been engendered with the American public and across the American political spectrum. And that is a very powerful stepping stone for them to use and to leverage as they push forward for their asks and obviously work to protect their opinion. And the Russians and Putin, they're starting obviously from very negative perceptions. When we ask about favorability with regard to Vladimir Putin and to Russia, it's some of the lowest favorability that we've seen historically, with less than 10 to 15% of the American public having any kind of favorable opinion towards them, and over 80% having a negative opinion. So in terms of the dynamic, it's a positive dynamic for the Ukrainians that they need to build up on, because these perceptions, as we've seen before, can shift very quickly. And again, the role of political communication, the bully pulpit, how the terms of the debate are set by President Trump and political leadership matters in getting voters to go along with different policies one way or another. And again, you see a consistent picture here. This is from the wave before in August, of a rising chorus to raise the stakes on Russia. But very importantly, American voters believe that Ukraine should receive security guarantees if it commits to negotiating and if it commits to a resolution on the war, which will require gives and takes. This is a position that the administration has been lukewarm on, especially coming out of the meeting in March, the Oval Office meeting in March. But there is a very, very strong consensus, again, close to 70% of voters and across all the political spectrum, that says Ukrainians should get security guarantees. We should not be in this position again. How those security guarantees come about, whether it's as Ukraine as a member of a security umbrella guaranteed by the United States, or a member of the European Union with security guarantees, or NATO, which obviously it's a farther stretch, voters actually support all of the different permutations, and we've tested them in the past. And again, voters want Trump to have a stronger line on Putin. This has been consistent from the very beginning. There was a bit of a normalization of Vladimir Putin coming out of Alaska, and some hopes that there might be a deal coming out of it, and you see that in the movement of the data. But by and large, when the president goes out there and says he's tapping me along, voters believe that, and they don't really trust the behavior of Russia and Russian leadership. And they think that Trump has been too soft on Putin and possibly too harsh on Zelensky. And again, a positive dynamic for the Ukrainian leadership. It's not enough in and of itself for them to reach traction with the Trump administration, and we'll see how they can do that in just a second, but certainly a positive starting point for them, which they've had since the beginning. And again, voters are pragmatic. I think one of the key achievements of the $1 trillion rare earth minerals deal that the Ukrainians signed with the United States, reluctantly, we would say, and that was a mistake on the part of the Ukrainians, because if you look at the history of the United States, this is the only global power in history that has not taken land or resources from countries that have vanquished, like Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, Ba'athist Iraq, let alone to go and kind of expropriate all these minerals. So as at least I've had many conversations with leadership in Ukraine, I've said when the president says and comes I want a $1 trillion deal, you offer him a $5 trillion deal. Throw Naftogaz in there, throw the oil pipelines, because at the end of the day, it will actually be a win-win situation for both you and the Ukrainian economy and rebuilding Ukraine, as it will for the United States. And you see the messaging is working. 69% today see the relationship with Ukraine as being intrinsically more valuable than the relationship with Russia. And this gives a lot of windows of opportunities for Ukraine to lean into this perception. And this is a perception that is believed, at least right now, within the White House. Part of the challenge for Ukraine is coalescing and galvanizing US business to go there and actually bring this deal to life. It's not the administration that leads business, but it's the business that usually leads the administrations into different places. And I think that there's still a lot of challenges with the fears that exist around doing business in Ukraine that need to be resolved by President Zelensky and his core and inner team. But there's a lot to work with here. And this question has not always been a 70-30 split. We can go back to the beginning of the year where it was more of a 50-50 split, and we can go back a year ago where actually voters believed that there was a lot more to achieve by partnering with Russia against China than there was with partnering Ukraine, which at that time they just saw as, an open-ended investment on the part of the US government, pushing hundreds of billions of dollars of support, but without actually a clear understanding what is in it for us, right? And some of the abstract understandings that it's securing peace in Europe and it's securing global order, those are a little bit more difficult to sell with voters that tend to be very pragmatic in their perceptions. And so that brings us to an end. Thank you again for the opportunity, and look forward to the questions from the audience.
Mr. Neshel, that was outstanding. Let me ask you a technical question which has political implications. Your poll treats Republicans as a group, but we know that within the party there are at least two different points of view. There are strong Trump supporters with an American first agenda that minimizes the importance of American allies and international commitments, as well as traditional Republicans who favor a strong internationalist policy. Is it possible or technically difficult to identify these two different groups for polling purposes?
We do identify them, and in fact, we track them in every single one of our polls, which we'll make available through Ambassador Herb's team to all of you, should you want to go into the crosstabs, as we call them,
I like the sound of that.
as pollsters. But what we notice in public opinion very, very clearly is that, again, the framing of the issue matters. President Trump pushed Republicans on this issue to be negative during the campaign, and has brought Republicans back into the consensus that Ukraine is an issue that we must support and we must push forward on. In part, that's because voters are not very well informed around the issues, generally speaking. Only about 20% of voters have any sense of what exactly the numbers are around specific issues. So they rely a lot more on their reactions in terms of what it is that they instinctively believe, or their values, or their principles. The good news is that this is the ultimate David and Goliath story, and that's a story that plays with conservative audience and with Republican audience because of the religious dimension to it, because Ukraine, obviously, has been suffering Russian aggression. But I think that we have to be very, very careful in terms of how the message is framed going forward, and voters are cross-pressured. So if it starts shifting in a direction that is not conducive to an end to the war or conducive towards supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainian issue, then that's where it's incumbent upon everyone in this room to make sure that the chorus on the other side is just as strong to hold the current consensus that we're seeing. But right now, MAGA Republicans are even more hawkish than traditional Republicans on the issue.
Okay. Just one point, I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator. I think that actually President Trump began to move in what I would consider to be the right direction before the election, when he allowed Johnson to put the Biden aid bill on the floor in April of 2024. And something he said then, which was not picked up by many people, that he said Ukraine's survival is important to the United States. But I agree with you that the shift has continued. And this is Norm, come to you. The poll demonstrates what I consider to be the sound geopolitical understanding of the US public, that Russia is in fact a dangerous actor whose aggression in Ukraine needs to be stopped for American interests. The view, of course, is shared by Democrats and Republicans and independents. It's striking that even more Republicans, 73%, than Democrats, 72%, want additional pressure on the Kremlin, arms to Ukraine. Okay, what does this say about the strength within the Republican Party of those voices calling for reduced American involvement in Europe and elsewhere?
You know, I think that it is a real insight into the understandings of what President Trump is actually doing on the ground. We've seen a shift from this idea that, you know, Ukraine is just being given billions and billions and billions of dollars. And now the communicating message of President Trump being able to say, no, look, NATO is purchasing those weapons from us. It is actually an economic opportunity for the US to be doing business, to be supporting Ukraine. I always be very specific when I'm talking about support for Ukraine, which is to be able to analyze that it is, in fact, a business deal for the United States. The support is not just being given out of our pockets anymore. It's obviously being purchased by NATO. That has done a significant impact within Republicans, I think, because they're understanding really how it's affecting Americans, and you're canceling out some of those fighting talking points. I think another thing is that this mineral deal, it's really, there's a lot of opportunity there for American oil interest, for drilling into minerals. I think it has a lot to do with the way that the president is messaging on those issues. So really seeing Ukraine as more of an opportunity rather than a dependency on us is really critical to changing the narrative and changing the understandings of conservatives on the issue.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Murphy, you were long a key staffer in Congress on the Democratic side before taking your current position. What does this poll suggest to you about public support for traditional, strong internationalist U.S. foreign policy?
Well, first, John, I really want to thank the Atlantic Council for having me, and thank Dritan and his team for really providing a service with this poll. Framing the debate, framing where the American people are on these issues is critically important right now, especially as, attention to Ukraine has, in a lot of respects, fallen off the radar, with such an attention put towards Gaza, justifiably so. We haven't had that attention. So this helps to sharpen the debate and really helps us to have that better understanding for where the American people are. Look, I found the results of this poll extremely encouraging across the board. As I look at the numbers with respect to, Democratic voters, there weren't many surprises in there. But to see how Republican support has shifted and to see the strength of Republican support, broadly speaking, for Ukraine, is extremely encouraging. There were two numbers that really stuck out to me. The first one was that 54% of Republicans thought that Putin is playing games here, right? And and you've seen that since Anchorage, since the red carpet was rolled out, 267 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. The EU's building in Kyiv has been hit. There's a British official building that was hit. Just today, a 7-year-old boy in Zaporizhia was killed with drone shrapnel. The American people see that for what it is, that we're getting played here, and that they want to see strong leadership coming from the White House. We've seen the rhetoric at least shift from the president, which is encouraging, right? Intimating that he would consider providing Tomahawks, saying things like, if Russian planes, make incursions into NATO territory, they should be shot down. All of that is encouraging, but none of it, as evidenced by the drone strike overnight, one of the biggest ones we've seen, none of it has, impacted Putin's calculation. So the rhetoric really does need to be backed up with action. The second number that really stuck out to me was that the poll, Dritan, I think, was done in sort of 2 stages. There was like an August tranche and then
It's a monthly
October.
poll, and we rerun some of the same questions.
Okay, so one of the slides that I saw from the August poll showed that 60% of Republicans support weapons for Ukraine, right? And that was very, very encouraging to me because that was before Trump's rhetoric turned with respect to tomahawks, with respect to, shooting down Russian planes. So, even without Trump kind of pushing it and, kind of pulling his, supporters along, they were already kind of there, 67% of them. So I think that, there's a lot of room for growth, especially if he does, ramp up that rhetoric even more and, more importantly, match it with action.
No, those are good observations. But, Americans never root for Bluto over Popeye. And somehow some people in the foreign policy realm had been rooting for Bluto, meaning Russia, the aggressor. So natural instincts kick in. Okay. Ms. Nisho, I can't tell you how many times journalists, foreign policy experts, even officials have come up to me and expressed surprise about this turn of Trump's rhetoric and some actions, such as slamming Moscow for entrenchments on the war, for issuing nuclear threats, or for that matter, outside of Europe, bombing Iran, claiming that it was dangerous for him with his political base. In other words, doing these things. With such a strong majority of Republicans polling for tougher measures against Russia, it would seem that Trump would pay at most a small price for his supporters, from part of his supporters, for taking a harder line. What do you think?
I think I share many of the same views as you do in terms of our need to support Ukraine and to bring this war to a resolution that is a honorable resolution and along the lines of peace through strength. With that goal in mind, I think that we are in a Goldilocks moment or opportunity here where the administration is very frustrated at Russia and it's waffling, or worse, it's trying to do it in terms of reaching the negotiating table and engaging in a negotiation. You have voters that are firmly behind the administration with very low expectations, which gives wide latitude for action to the president and to the administration. And you have, in one of our other polls, essentially voters believing that the Europeans have never been more united in this issue. They attribute it to the fact that Trump pushed them there. But you have also the Europeans and the Americans closer than they've ever been on this specific issue, at least since the election period started here in 2024. So I think that there's immense opportunity. The big question mark for me is, what will Ukraine do to solidify that opportunity? There were some Ukrainian political actors, like former Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Chernyshov, that actually were the first after the March blow-up in the Oval Office to start making serious inroads at the highest level of the administration and landing the point that you have a lot more to gain with us than you have with Russia. Unfortunately, they're not in the political realm anymore, given the recent reshuffles, and I think that those types of initiatives are very important to be sustained rather than to be interrupted, because the United States is the most important relationship with Ukraine, and maybe since UNGA and since the meetings between Yermak and Witkoff there and others, they've started to gain some traction together. But between March and at least June, July, Ukraine had zero traction with the Trump administration. I mean, zero traction. And they were in a very, very precarious situation because it's the relationship that they need the most, even above the support that the Europeans can give them. And so I think that the question mark here for me is really, what is Ukraine doing? How are the Ukrainians going to capitalize on this Goldilocks moment? In my personal opinion, they need to do a lot more. They need to be a lot more present here. And they need to reactivate the political figures that they have that actually have strong relationships with conservatives in the United States all the way to the Trump White House, and can speak their language, which is the language of business and the language of the win-win deal, the art of the deal, rather than more abstract concepts of, we're doing this because it's good to do this. And that's a little bit of a more difficult sell for this administration.
Thank you. Ms. Dornbus, the same question for you, but then a second related question. There have been reports for months about Republican uneasiness in Congress with the reluctance of the administration to actually take strong measures against Putin, not just to talk about measures. But this concern has largely been muffled. Do you think that the finding this poll of large majority support for strong U.S. policy could lead to a more energetic push from Republicans in the Congress to move the administration?
I think certainly, the work that you do with these polls in showing our leaders what the Americans actually want is always impactful. Certainly when you've got a populist president and a Congress that really doesn't go until he says, yes, it's time. But I do think, going back to the first question, it's not lost on me that the America First idea, it's not isolationist inherently. People believe that it's isolationist, America First, but America First is not America only. America First really developed in 2016 with the first election as this idea of America preeminence, American exceptionalism, if you will. This is very ingrained within the Republican Party, that America stands out as a leader in the world. So when you get these minority talking points that are oftentimes the loudest, saying that they speak up and they speak for the Republican Party when they say America only, when they actually, when it's clearly not actually America First, we just can't listen to those totally loud voices all the time. We have to listen to the American people and hear what they want to say. And clearly this poll is showing that they support more American exceptionalism, really, in President Trump's deal making to end this war. They're really encouraged by the steps that he's made so far, not only in Ukraine, but throughout the world. And I have a lot of faith within conservative readers that they understand these intricacies, that the United States does have a role to play here, and Trump is really the one who can make it happen.
Let me give you a follow-up. I agree with your analysis. It seems to me that we've seen Trump, at least going back to the bombing of the Houthis in March, then the bombing of Iran, and then especially when Putin had his tried and true tactic of threatening nukes, moving American submarines closer to Russia, him defining his policy in a way that distinguished itself from those loud voices from the MAGA right. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. I was shocked, as the world was, when those bombings on Iran actually happened. And I thought that is the strength that we have been hearing President Trump say. He has resurrected that great phrase by President Reagan, peace through strength. But for so long, we were hearing peace through strength, but we weren't necessarily seeing that strength. Maybe it was happening behind the scenes. But really, with that bombing that set Iran back, years, 10 years at least, it was the signal to the world that don't mess with Trump. He is what you fear, and he has the ability to show that strength. And I think really that speaks louder for not just that conflict, but it has effects for the others.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Murphy, I've been a long fan of the bipartisan efforts of Lindsey Graham and Dick Blumenthal pushing for legislation for major economic pressure on Moscow. But their efforts have stopped short of forcing a vote in Congress in the face of White House reluctance to move. Again, do you think there might be real political impact on this issue from those polls demonstrating strong bipartisan American support for ramping up the pressure on the Kremlin?
I certainly hope so, but the clear message from the leadership in the Senate has been the opposite, right? That they aren't acting based upon public opinion. They aren't acting based upon the fact that there are, last I checked, 83 or 84 co-sponsors of that bill. So, a majority such that, you can overcome a veto. that they're taking the direction from the president and from the White House. And Thune has said as much. And as soon as we get the green light, we're ready to move ahead. And it's an elliptical sort of argument because, if Trump gives the green light, that means that he's on board with the strategy. And, he actually doesn't need the authority from these bills to act. And he's shown that, especially with respect to tariffs, right? He doesn't need an authority from Congress. So if he makes that calculation in his head that I'm okay with this legislation, then he can act immediately. He doesn't need to wait for the legislative process. So this kind of elliptical form of argument, we need that green light, it just doesn't really compute or make sense. And what I do is go back to a similar instance that we faced in 2017 when there was growing concern in Congress about the first Trump administration's approach towards Russia. And we worked together in a bipartisan way with people like, you mentioned Lindsey Graham, John McCain was a strong leader on these issues. And we passed the CATSA bill, which the Trump administration hated. And it passed 98-2, and it was a veto-proof majority, and he had to sign it into law, right? So, there have been instances, and that was a Republican-controlled Senate at the time. So there have been instances in the past where the first article branch of government has been willing to stand up and push back when they believe what they're believe in what they're pushing. The capability is there if they want to do it. And I think that that's the only action that matters, right? If they wait for Trump to give the green light, it's too late, and it's not, it doesn't really affect the debate. If they're really willing to stand up and push this, that would really accelerate the U.S. pressure campaign.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got 20 minutes left. I've got a bunch of questions. I'm only going to ask one question for the panel, which I hope you'll answer economically, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. The polls show strong public support, 69%, across the political spectrum for security guarantees for Ukraine. Regular talks on this issue have been going on since the Oval Office summit of the European Seven with Trump on August 18, but the going has been slow. Might these polls give the administration reason to more, with greater emphasis, or not just greater emphasis, but be willing to move more strongly towards American support for security guarantees? The bigger issue here has been, first, their intelligence support, which I think the administration is willing to provide, logistical support with our equipment and such, which it's willing to provide. But the real kicker is American backup for European troops deployed. So with that as a framing, 60 seconds each, might this poll move the administration to be more forthcoming on this issue?
The short answer is yes, and I think you gave the answer yourself in the last few sentences, which is what I've learned about American public opinion on issues of war and peace is that Americans will support any kind of engagement as long as an American general leads it and there's no American boots on the ground. So if that formula is in place, then they certainly would support giving a lot of armament, a lot of advanced technology for security guarantees.
For our audience edification, no one is talking, almost no one is talking about American boots on the ground, but we have extraordinary assets in the air and elsewhere which can be brought to bear. Okay, that's right. Please.
Yeah, we don't have American boots on the ground, but I do think part of this discussion is highlighting the similarities that we have with the Ukrainians, especially when we're speaking to conservative audiences. This is a country that is founded, when you speak to Ukrainians, it's very clear that they share the same values of faith, family, and freedom. I always call it the 3 Fs. Those are the things that really unite Americans with Ukrainians, as well as, we've had about 92, 96 Americans die in Ukraine, fighting for Ukraine. They were volunteers serving in the Foreign Legion. I don't think that gets enough talked about enough. The RTW Foundation is doing great work there. So I think when we are talking about seeing these polls and hoping to see more support in the public, I think absolutely the polls have everything to do with what we can expect next out of policy.
It's worth remembering as you talk about American soldiers going there to fight. It's like American pilots flying in the IRF for the UK, for Britain, before we entered World War II. Okay. Damon.
I would say two things. One, I think we need to watch closely what happens with respect to Gaza, right? So the president just this week made a commitment of sending 200 troops to deal with the situation there. Made clear that those troops wouldn't be going into Gaza itself, but the fact that they're on the ground is important. So, I think how that engagement goes, if the American people show that they're okay with that, I think that has an impact as to what the security guarantees look like with respect to Ukraine. I think the other point that needs to be made over and over by policymakers who support a more assertive approach with respect to Ukraine is that Ukraine is becoming a security producer, a security provider in a way that is really historic in terms of the speed with which it's happened. It's not just the consumer. So Ukraine is pumping out millions of drones, so much more than the United States is even capable of producing. So, that point needs to be made that yes, while we may be making sacrifices with respect to providing security guarantees, we do get a lot in return in terms of Ukraine being a security producer.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay. You had to bear with me because I am a technological dinosaur. We'll start with people in the audience. I see Ariel Cohen has his hand up, so then we'll move to our distant audience, our virtual audience.
Hi, Ariel Cohen, non-resident senior fellow here. Fascinating stuff, and this goes back to my salad years as audience research manager for Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, how important it is to do both the qualitative and quantitative focus groups, et cetera. In this particular research, do you have a sense who are the minority, who are the 30% that do not support our engagement with Ukraine, our support of Ukraine? Is it far right? Is it far left? How you describe them? Do they believe that Vladimir Putin is the knight on the white horse to save Western Christianity and the white race, as some people on Twitter X are saying, or it's something else? So just stone cold isolationist. Thank you.
Great question. I think it's a mixture of three different flavors. You see that independents were not as strong in their support as actually the partisans, and part of that is a particular fatigue of international engagements and a concern that independents have that, frankly, we are been providing the support on our credit card and running a $38 trillion debt in the process of doing it. So that is definitely one of the flavors. The second flavor, which applies more to the Democrats, is more of a visceral reaction towards the president and the administration than it is towards the actual policies. And you see this fairly consistently with this administration. And when we do this scorecard every month of support on its policies, out of 24 or more policies or stated goals that the administration has, there's only one that doesn't receive 50% support. But then when you look at job approval on how these policies are being carried out, you see 10-point drops, 20-point drops, 30-point drops. So I think that to some extent, it's this visceral reaction that Democrats in particular, but also some independents have more in terms of how things are being done rather than what the goals are. Because we forget that President Trump is not a traditional Republican. I mean, he's a Democrat circa 1980s and sort of has also brought in the working class and white-collar voters into the Republican Party and it's expanded its base in a way that we haven't seen in at least 30 years since, Ronald Reagan or beyond. And so I think that applies to the Democrats a lot more, which is more about the means and the methods rather than the ends. And then in terms of Republicans, you do have a core of the Republican base that just doesn't want to deal with this issue, more isolationist, much more Jacksonian in its nature. Don't tread on me, leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone in terms of its views and perspective. But taken together, this is what makes up the 30%. There's no one particular thread that dominates in terms of defining that 30%.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll try now a virtual question. For those in the virtual audience, you can find us as AskAC, askac.org. All right, as I said, I'm a tech dinosaur. Here's a question from Misha Mazalevsky, and I think it's supposed to appear on the screen, but somehow that's not happening.
It's behind us.
Oh, there it is. Good. So you see it. With public attention to the war decreasing since 2022, how do you ensure that polling results aren't skewed towards those who still follow the Russian invasion closely? Again, for you, Mr. Nisho.
Well, the polling results are of everyone. I think that the public's awareness of what's going on in Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia war is very, very high. And people are capturing information across all different channels. So I actually don't agree with the premise that the public is less interested in the war or less engaged in the war. Actually, what happens is the public learns more about the war and about an issue the longer it drags on, and then it makes up its mind along the lines of what it believes and what its values are, and they're not. And in this case, you see that short of the political communication coming in and leadership pointing their base in one direction or another, there's a fairly consistent support in the United States vis-a-vis Ukraine and in terms of helping Ukraine.
Thank you. Question in the audience. And please identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Jack Krapansky. I submitted some questions online too, but I'm unaffiliated. So my question is, we use there in a couple of the poll questions. There was the phrase "end the war." So when you say "end the war," was there a framing statement as to what that meant? I mean, was that full military victory, or was that negotiated settlement? Was that a weak negotiated settlement where there's a few concessions, or is it a throw in the towel where there's severe land concessions? Is there a sense of whether it ended in the next year or the next 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years? So, or if a military victory took 5 years, would that maybe worse or better than a severe concession that occurred in the next year? Things like that. Thanks.
So we have polled this in many different ways. I think that we might have over the last 3 years close to 1,000 questions that we've asked on Ukraine, which we can make available to anyone that is interested in. I will tell you that we don't define it because it's the respondents' self-understanding. There's no appetite for the war to continue for 5 more years amongst American voters. They want a resolution sooner rather than later, but they want a resolution that is an honorable resolution for Ukraine and obviously peace through strength. And sometimes we neglect that voters are cross-pressured, and you could have 2 potentially paradoxical positions in their mind at the same time. That's why, again, political communication is so important in terms of helping them get to the right place and keeping them there as we're seeing right now. But right now, there's a lot of support for providing security guarantees for Ukraine on one side of the spectrum and making sure that this issue is solved once and for all. There is some acceptance of potential territorial concessions that need to be made amongst voters. They have a more pragmatic view, and again, territory matters more to Easterners than it matters to Americans, which are more forward-looking in their predisposition. I say this as someone who was born in Eastern Europe, so it's also, there's that tension that's in place there. But at the same time, they want the war to end, they want the bloodshed to end, and they want to do so in a way that's favorable towards Ukraine.
Thank you. I'll try another question from our virtual audience. This is from Mike Michajlak, and pardon me if I mispronounced your last name. Is it on the screen? Yes. During the mid-1990s, I formed an IROS code nonprofit organization, the Struton Institute, whose function was technology transfer from Ukraine to the US. But I was told that Ukraine was A, corrupt, B, technologically backward, and furthermore, Ukraine is not really a country. How do we assess this?
Yeah, I'll take that. I travel to Ukraine pretty often for the New York Post, and I have been amazed at the technological advancements of Ukraine. I am perpetually forgetting my wallet anywhere I go. It's my bad habit. And in Ukraine, you just take out your phone and your ID, and everything that you need is right there on the phone. And I think that's really fantastic and maybe a different conversation. But again, with the technological advancements, that's one of the major advancements that we're going to have partnering with Ukraine, especially when it comes to drone technology. These things that they are producing are phenomenal. The drone landscape right now is nothing that we in the United States are prepared for. When you're talking about FPV drones that can be driven directly into targets and they cannot be jammed, they are powered by fiber optics. These types of technologies that can counter systems like that, I think that Ukraine has not gotten enough credit for being as technologically advanced as it actually is. And clearly your work was in the mid-90s. I'm sure it was a very different landscape. That was a new country at the time. We're 30 years into Ukraine's advancements now. And I think that you can definitely bank on more partnerships between the US and Ukraine.
Thank you. And Mrs. Murphy, you want to add to talk about corruption in Ukraine as a country?
Well, I would just add, like, as I looked at those 3 bullet points, I mean, those sound like Russian talking points, right? Ukraine's not a real country. Ukraine is, hopelessly corrupt. So, I think, collectively, we all should be pushing back against, those three pieces as supporters of Ukraine. On the point on corruption, I do think that, as a friend of Ukraine, we need to be sending them, clear, strong messages that, that this needs to be dealt with. And I think that has been, a bipartisan effort going back years now, from the U.S. side, and should continue. I would also say that, when I first came to work on Ukraine issues around the time of the Orange Revolution, to see the evolution from then till now is totally night and day. So while there still is clearly work to be done, I also think we need to acknowledge all the great work that's happened over these past 20 years.
Thank you. All right, question from the audience, the in-person audience. Oh, okay, here we go.
Thank you. I didn't want to take another question. I'm Misha Mazalewski. I submitted another one, but I decided to take this chance. So thank you for conducting this poll. Maybe would you consider adding a question that would ask, for how long would the American public consider supporting Ukraine? Because let's say this war ends next year, or it could go on for 5 or 10 years. And maybe it would be interesting to find out, like, would the Americans be supportive of this war for as long as Ukraine needs their help? Thank you.
Right, I think, look, voters are notoriously bad at projecting what they will do in the future, so you can't really ask them that. Context matters, circumstances matter, causes matter. So I think that the best thing that we can do is keep on tracking it. And again, it's incumbent upon, I think that we are in a very positive environment. The atmospherics of this poll, as you look at it, are very positive towards Ukraine. But Ukraine has to be present in Washington, right? And as I mentioned, there were some fits and starts, then they got interrupted, mainly because it has to do with the politics and the palace intrigue in Kiev rather than what happens in Washington. There needs to be consistency. Like, this is the moment and the window of opportunity for Ukraine, because 6 months from now, we might be in a very different place. And again, Russia, whether we like it or not, still is a global power. The United States' main geopolitical adversary is still China, as we think about the next 50 to 100 years. And Russia, even though it has cozened up to China out of necessity, it has a lot more interest with the West than it does with China, which frankly has irredentist claims on Russian territories, sparsely populated Russian territories, next to a country that doesn't perhaps have enough land for its 1.5 billion population and growing. So you have to understand that broader dynamic, right? And so there's also another side at the table here that can put in a lot of things and a lot of offers for the United States. And it is a race of who gets to it first, who locks in the administration first in terms of its policy and its strategy.
I just wanted to speak to that support issue. Again, let's look at the word support. What does it mean to support Ukraine? Does it mean to send blank checks? Does it mean to send weapons? Does it mean to sell weapons? Does it mean to partner more? I just had a lovely interview with Ambassador Olha Stefanishyna, the new Ukrainian ambassador to the US. She has really strong ideas on how to build on the partnership of the US. So it's no longer this idea of Ukraine is taking so much from us, but rather we're getting a lot back by partnering with Ukraine. And that type of a partnership can see quote unquote support, at least in the public opinion sphere, that can see that last much longer, I think, than maybe prior ways that we thought about supporting Ukraine.
Thank you. I'll take the final question from a virtual questioner. There we go. Okay, this is from Larissa Doroshenko. She questions the effectiveness of sanctions and wants to know about the consequences of economic pressure on the BRICS from economic sanctions. Ms. Dobros.
Yeah, I think it's key to really dig down on this Russian oil issue. We have sanctions that were just, that were continued on a Serbian and Russian gas line that were just placed just this past week, really cutting off that Russian oil pipeline. That's how Russia is continuing to pay for its war on Ukraine. They don't care about what kind of kills or destruction they receive. As long as they have that Russian oil, they are able to keep up the war in a war of attrition. So certainly I think we're going to see more pressure on BRICS to address this issue, but also we really have to see Europe come on board with the United States. And when I say Europe, there are specific countries that need to come to the table. But in order to actually get this war to end, it's going to come down to oil.
Murphy, you want to add anything on this question?
I would just add that the most successful sanctions regimes in history have not been the United States doing it alone. We have to work closely with our allies. We have to make sure that they're on board. We have to pull everybody along. And I think that that has been made more difficult by the administration's approach with several countries around the world where, with respect to the tariffs policy, we've made trying to get them to do other things with us that are important, like sanctions, more difficult.
Thank you. Ms. Nisho, final word?
I agree with everything that has been said, so keep it simple.
Thank you to you and Harris for bringing this event to us. Thanks our participants. This was a wonderful conversation for our audience both here and virtually.
Thank you.